Hello, we're John and Elizabeth. We're beside Corrick. We're inside the Crinan Canal where we have very nearly come to the end of our transit.
We just have one more lock to go.
Hope you enjoy this video. All the guidance that we read and everybody we spoke to on the way up said, make sure you enjoy the transit of the canal. And it took us a little while to get into that mode, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is stunning. It's hard work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we arrived at Ardrushig, and we rushed into the first lock. We maybe should have waited a little while to get ourselves sorted out, but we rushed in, but it was all fine and we were very well looked after.
Yeah, the staff were exceptional.
Transited our way through, arrived here, and we weren't going to stay 2 nights, but we did, and that's been a joy.
I think it's about taking full advantage of the licence, because it does allow you to to have 4 nights.
4 nights, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll show you a little bit of our passage, talk a little bit about what went well and what we could have maybe done a tiny bit better. But notwithstanding the fact we've got one more to go, it's been a decidedly pleasurable experience.
Keep your fingers crossed.
For those not familiar with the canal, it's a 9-mile canal just here that cuts off the Mull of Kintyre. The entry point to the canal is here at Ardrushig, and for our purposes we decided to get reasonably close, and we put ourselves just about 12 miles south in Tarbert for the weekend before, get ourselves sorted out. Tarbert used to be fishing village, now very much a yachting centre, reasonably big marina, and very friendly and helpful. We really enjoyed our stay there, and the boat attracted a lot of favourable comment. Went for a few walks. This is a panoramic view from up by the top of the castle, looking down over the harbour and the marina, but also we walked over to the loch at the backside of it. But we left the next morning and headed off to Ardrushig. The sail we had was really very pleasant, slightly breezier than we'd anticipated, but fun nonetheless. One thing you should do before you get to the point that we got to is download the skipper's guide to the Crinan Canal. And we were maybe overly concentrating on the mechanics of getting through the canal, but there's a huge amount of information in that skipper's guide and also the pilot in terms of the things to do around the canal. And there are a lot of them. But we arrived at Ardrushig, got ourselves ready to get alongside. Normally the sea locks are open on the seaward side, and it was the case when we arrived. So a little bit of a scamper. We got our lines ready. We were using 2 rather thin but quite long lines to do our transit. I saw a couple of different mechanisms. A couple of people seem to have purpose built lines. I think people who'd done the transit a few times, they had lines that were almost exactly the right length, eye in one end to go over the hook and just long enough to go on the deck. But we were using something that we use when we're alongside other boats. So maybe a little bit too much string for us, but it was light and easy to throw. So we got ourselves sorted out outside of the marina, not the marina, outside the sea lock gate, and made our way in. As we made our approach, we could see that the winds inside the lock were negligible, so it was just a case of motor in and fairly conventional little alongside. We could see that the lockkeeper who we had spoken to on the VHF was standing by to take a line, and certainly for the first few locks, the lock staff, the canal staff, help boats through. I guess they're trying very much to make sure that they get things through, because there are a couple of road bridges that need to be managed, so it's disrupting the flow of traffic if people dawdle. But as we approached, Elizabeth was then able to ping her line up onto the lockkeeper herself, She got hold of that, and then we were basically taking the lines from the boat round a hook on the jetty and then back. I managed to throw my line and managed to get it straight in the sea, but slightly embarrassing. But we then got our head rope back on the boat. Once that was on, she was then able to take my line, successfully thrown the second time, thankfully enough. And then we then just basically took that line back onto the boat, and basically we were secured by a very long line ahead and a very long line astern, and that sorted us out. Once we'd got in and secured, we weren't sure if we'd be waiting for a little while, but actually it turned out that there was nobody else behind us, so there was nothing else to come in, and there were a couple of boats on their way out at Ardrushig, so they shut the sea lock doors themselves, and then the canal staff operated the necessary mechanisms to flood us up. So if you are on your own, you do some of the middle locks on your own, but the sea locks at either end are controlled by the canal staff. I think this is mainly to do with the fact that there are also a couple of road bridges involved, and the last thing they want to do is hold up traffic. But it's fair to say that the staff who were there were super helpful in all respects, and very free and easy with advice on how to do things, and a lot of really good advice in terms of just exactly where the water flows would be inside and how to control things. And very much what we were doing here is keeping the bow in a little bit, and we put a fender board just forward of our shrouds, so all of the way is just forward of the mast. Elizabeth's holding the bow in, I'm keeping the stern in a tiny bit, but the water as this comes in is all flowing essentially from the gate on our port side over onto the starboard side of the lock, so we're in reasonably untroubled waters. As I've said already, the staff were very helpful, and they had a nice conversation with us about how we were going to transit through, whether we were going to try and get through in one go. And actually there was almost no chance that we were going to be able to do that, because we arrived shortly after lunchtime. But where were we going to stop? Where were we going to take a break? How much time were we going to spend? And you get the sense that they are juggling a whole pile of boats on their way through in order to make the whole thing as effective and efficient and pleasurable as possible, whilst minimising the number of movements of the gates. And obviously there's quite a loss of water every time they do some sort of movement, and they're trying to keep that to a minimum. But we got up the first few gates, and then we were meandering our way through. They gave us a hard copy guide, and we had a good study of that as we made our way down the very beautiful canal over the top of Ardrushig, past Loch Gilphead, and the whole thing was really very pleasant indeed. And we were fortunate that it was sunshine and blue skies, and we got to our first stop, and we tied up at Cairn Barn, where we were able to visit the local hotel and have a quiet night there, absolutely on our own. Because of the movement of various boats, we decided to stay until about mid-morning, so Elizabeth managed to get a good run in.
We had a couple of good throws and a couple of average throws yesterday, so we've been practicing a bit. One thing that is handy to be able to do, and I don't know if we're going to do it the whole time here, is put a weighted rope knot into the rope. So if you go up and down, so you've got 4 strands in front of you, and then at the top, go round nice and tight, a bit like a stopper knot. You've got one extra turn, then put the tail in the loop. Pull the loop tight at that end, then pull it tight there, but don't pull it all the way through, then you have a bit of a stopper knot.
Afraid the windmill has got a bit too much here. Preparation is key in this throwing line. You want to make sure the line is well coiled, and split the coils into 2 hands. A big set of coils in the hand that is going to hold the secure end, and the very small coils in the one that you're throwing. Now throw either underhand or sideways, but not overhand, because you want this to go up. And make sure you throw it straight, and off it goes. And that travelled about 15 or 18 metres in a reasonably straight line, and it would have gone up onto the dockside if we had. And that knot that's in the end, which isn't a stopper knot because it's open at the end, you can simply pull that and it will come straight out, allowing you to put that rope round a cleat or through an eye. So after a fairly leisurely morning, we locked into the next lock, and we were joined by another boat going through. They had a pilot on board, so it is possible to pay for somebody to come with you and help you through, and you can see him up at the top of the lock gate, and he's got a boat hook in order to take the line from the boat as it comes through. And these guys had their lines that looked specially adapted for it. He simply hooked it on, and they then controlled the line on their deck in the same way that we were, but we had it doubled up, and that seemed to work as well, but it definitely needed 3 people to make that work, whereas our system would have worked with 2, because the lines were being able to be controlled on the boat at the same time. Once they had come in, got ourselves positioned, and we were fended on both sides at this stage, it was then a case of the doors of that lock were then shut, and we were on our way back up. This particular lock gate was where there was a bridge, and therefore there was staff there to help as well, so the many hands make light work, and both of the gates shut at the same time, with us both inside. We were then locked in with our partner boat, and we continued to then climb up. This was about halfway up, halfway through the up sequence, and this particular lock was well manned because there was a road bridge there as well. But once we'd got through those few locks, and there was a reasonably long stretch, and it was deeply pleasant to be pottering through, making our way down the canal as we had done the previous day, but being able to take in the various lovely little cottages and so forth that sat at the side. Really very pleasant indeed. That said, not everything works as it should. This was one where we were trying to make our way down, but there was so much water spilling in, so we were emptying in front of us, but the weight of water behind us was spilling over the top, and so we travelled down a bit, and then it started to fill up faster than the one was emptying, so not everything worked quite as it should. Very grateful to the pilot who was accompanying the other boat. He'd seen this before. I would have been a little bit flummoxed about how to get rid of the lock behind, but the lock keeper was there as well, and eventually they managed to empty it faster than it was filling. But it was fairly turbulent at that point, and I did get a little bit anxious. I wish I'd had a few more fenders, although quite where I would have stoned them was an interesting question. But we got through safely, and we arrived in Crinan. A very gorgeous sunset over the Gulf of Corryvreckan there, and we had a very pleasant evening in the hotel there. The license for Crinan allows you to spend 4 days, or you can buy a license for any number of days, but the minimum is 4. And we'd spent 2, and we suddenly thought, well, actually this is such a gorgeous place, why don't we spend a little bit more time here? And we explored a little bit around the village, and there's a woods nearby, but it was also very pleasant to watch other boats going through, and this is a Nicholson 40 going through, a Dutchman I think, and I've sailed a Nicholson 55, so that was jolly pleasant. But it was also interesting to watch people coming in, going through the process as a bystander. So this shows the water coming in, and you can see one boat in there, and you can see they open the gate on the same side as the boat. The water then shoots across and down one side, and then creates a little bit of an eddy at the back. So it is best to be slightly bow in, but not to lose control of the stern line, otherwise there's a problem. And while we were there, we managed to get some very nice shots of the boat. This is one taken from the gallery of the hotel just behind us, and still getting used to flying the drone. So this was early in the morning. Managed to get it up and fly this over the loch. Absolutely still, absolutely gorgeous. It may be that it's always possible to have too much of a good thing, but we decided to leave, and this was shortly after lunch on our second day in Crinan. Fully watered the boat, and again, sunshine and blue skies, very benign indeed, and we made our way into the very final loch, Loch 15. Again, because these sea locks are electric and quite a bit more modern than the ones in the middle, they are entirely manned by the Canal Staff. Elizabeth and I really enjoyed our couple of days on the canal, and the staff really did go out of the way to make you feel as if it was something to be enjoyed rather than pushed through. There was no pressure at all in order to move at any given time, to fit in with anything, to align your schedule with some other boat. It really was a case of them saying to us, what would you like to do? So I wanted to get away. I wanted to pick up the tide. We also needed to pick up fuel, so shortly after lunch we'd gone in. They then locked us out on our own, which was fine. It's a little bit less nerve-wracking when you're in the lock on their own, because you don't have to keep your eye on the other side. But we dropped down nice and gently. Elizabeth kept the bow very slightly in, as I've said before, just in order to keep the fender board engaged with the lock side. And I was able to control my line from about midships, where I was able to then just occasionally just bear off very slightly. Not so much on this lock, because it is very much smoother, but on some of the locks that were a bit rough, there was a tiny risk of the fender board riding up over the fender. And so I tended to position myself here in order just to bear us off. But the process of travelling down is considerably less turbulent than the process of travelling up, when of course you don't have gallons of water toppling in from the lock behind you. And this particular one was well managed and well run and nicely balanced, I guess. And we dropped down nice and gently until such time as they were able to allow us to escape the canal. Sad to leave. Really enjoyed our couple of days inside the Crinan Canal. We weren't massively low on fuel. We had probably about half a tank, and we'd made a conscious decision not to fuel up in Tarbert or Ardrushig. So we spent 5 minutes inside the Crinan Basin looking for diesel, and it wasn't there. And then we found out that actually it's just outside. The diesel here is run by Crinan Boatyard, and they have a tiny little temporary pontoon with a diesel tank at the far end. So once we had exited the canal, we came out, and this is one of these plastic pontoons, so just it feels a little bit wobbly when you wander on it, but we'd had a good reconnoitre of it the previous day, so that was fine. And the wind conditions were not bad at all. There's just a tiny risk of being blown down. The wind at this point was right behind us, so Elizabeth prepared the stern line. We inched our way in, and as soon as she was able to step ashore, onto the pontoon rather. She got in there. As you can see, it's very wobbly indeed, and she was able to get that line round the ring, and then I got it on, and we were being blown down and onto the pontoon. So just by holding onto the stern line, we were absolutely fine. Got fueled up, and then we were off. And very champagne sailing. There is a reasonably famous patch of water just outside Crinan, known as the Doris Moor, sometimes known as the little version of Corryvreckan being the gap between Scarborough and Jura that you can see right ahead of us. But we had 10 or 12 knots of breeze, and we were pretty much at slack water as we came out. So started and very nicely from the southwest, so tiny little bit of a beat to get out through the gap, but it was particularly lovely. Well, we left Crinan, we'd fully fueled, fully watered, champagne sailing conditions as we exited, and we were reflecting on it later on the afternoon. We very much enjoyed the whole Crinan experience. It wasn't an obstacle that you needed to get through, it was something to be enjoyed. And we're glad that we did. The advice that I would give anybody is have a really good look at the skipper's guide, look at it in detail, not just for the mechanics of getting through the locks and where everything is, but the things around the outside. We spent the day before we checked out having a very lovely stroll up above Crinan itself, so it took some really lovely photographs, and it was particularly enjoyable. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope it's useful to you if you're doing Crinan or another canal. Thank you very much for watching.